Hey guys, so in this video, we'll be talking about the mechanisms of inflammation. So what exactly is inflammation? Inflammation is an event that occurs as a result of tissue damage. So when the tissues of the body are damaged, inflammation occurs. All right, so inflammation basically is divided into two phases, right? We have what we call the vascular phase, which has to do with the blood vessels, and we have the cellular phase, which has to do with the cells. Now, inflammation is divided into three major stages. All right, two phases: vascular, cellular. Then we have three stages, which are firstly vasodilation. The first phase is called vasodilation, has to do with dilation of the blood vessel. The second stage is what we call the permeability of the vessel. All right. So vascular permeability, and thirdly, we have migration of immune cells or white blood cells, and we're going to be talking about each of these stages one after the other. All right. So let's assume this is our cells, the tissue of the body, right? And they're made up of cells. And we also have the hypodermis. So you have the epidermis and you have the hypodermis and you have the blood vessels. So let's look at the reactions that occur in inflammation. The first thing we'd have to look at here is the type of cells that sit outside the space between the epidermis and the blood vessels. And we have cells like the mast cells. So this could be the mast cell. This could be what we call the macrophages, and then you have the dendritic cells, yeah, because they have um, dendritic appearance. Now, what does each of these cells do to facilitate this whole process of inflammation? The first thing that happens is that the mast cell begins to secrete what we call histamine. But before the secretion of histamine, there must be something that will lead to inflammation. So remember, we said inflammation is tissue damage, right? Event that happens as a result of tissue damage. So let's assume that the tissue of the body are damaged. All right. For example, you stepped on a nail. So if you step on a nail, you would have, let's say, a nail into your skin or on under your leg. What happens is that the cells of that region are destroyed. All right. Now, the nail entering into your skin can come in with certain microorganisms, certain bacteria, and the body senses that bacteria as a foreign body or an antigen. So in this case, what happens? The mast cells, immediately after sensing an antigen, begins to secrete what we call histamine. So the mast cells secretes histamine. These are important chemicals. The macrophages, on the other hand, secrete things like the prostaglandins and every other cells secrete the cytokines. Now, all these chemokines work together to bring about inflammation. All right, so when histamine is secreted, it jumps into the bloodstream, and what does it do? It begins to carry out the first stage of inflammation, which has to do with vasodilation. So it begins to dilate the blood vessel. It begins to make the blood vessel wider. It begins to make the blood vessel wider. All right. Now, the dilation of the blood vessel, what does it do? It brings fluid or blood from other parts of the body to the site of infection. So the blood is coming with more white blood cells, more red blood cells, more army to fight against this foreign body that has entered the body. Okay, remember that inflammation is actually a good thing. So it's a way the body fights against foreign body that enters the body. So it is part of the innate immune system. Now, all these activities are characterized by four signs. So there are four basic signs of inflammation. We have signs like pain, um, redness, swelling, and heat. So these are the four basic signs of inflammation. All right. So the moment the vessel dilates, becomes large as a result of blood flowing into the site of infection, the signs that will manifest here is redness because of the number, because of the volume of blood rushing into the site of infection, and heat because of the volume of blood. So that will do what? Will increase temperature. So that will increase the temperature. So that's what happens when histamine enters into the bloodstream. The next stage is the vascular permeability. Now, how does this happen? The prostaglandins and every other cytokines enters into the bloodstream and begin to cause the cells of the epithelial of the blood vessel, right? The epithelial of the blood vessel, it begins to cause them to retract. So the cells become smaller. So we now begin to have holes between cells. So instead of the cells to be locked in, right, like every other cells in every part of the body, because of the inflammation happening here, the cells begin to retract. So that's what we call vascular permeability. The cells begin to become porous, begin to be permeable. So you now have holes between the cells. So the cells are no longer locked in together. So you now have these holes. Now, what does this hole do? They are very important because they actually lead to the third stage of inflammation, which has to do with migration of white blood cells. So we know that in the blood vessel, we have both the red blood cell and the white blood cell. So the moment this permeability happens, fluid from the blood vessel begins to leak out, begins to leak out. So the fluid containing uh, um, other blood cells that are macrophages in nature, that are actually that can enter through cells, that can go between cells. So those cells can have the ability to come out of these openings. So when that happens, the fluid leaks out to different parts of the site of localized infection. Okay, so that's leads to the next thing that happens. So inside the blood vessels, the blood at that particular part of infection will become thicker. So the red blood cells will become thicker. The red blood cells, rather, will become thicker as a result of great number of fluid, great amount of fluid, rather, flowing out of the blood vessels. Now, these are the red blood cells. Now, what about the white blood cells? The white blood cells does something. It begins to move to the margins of the blood vessel. So the white blood cell begins to move up to the margin of the blood vessel. So what does that do? It helps them to pass through these spaces to assist these other cells in fighting the infection. So cells, majorly neutrophils that are phagocytic in nature, comes out of the blood vessel and begins to engulf these bacteria, thereby clearing all infection in that particular spot. All right, so um, the next thing that happens after that, we've talked about migration of white blood cells. So the neutrophil comes out of the blood vessel. Okay, now these also lead to the other signs. So because of the retraction of cells, we would have what we call swelling. So that particular part of the body that is infected will begin to swell. All right. And how do we now categorize the pain? Now, in the skin, we have receptors, right? So we have things like nerves. nerves of in the skin. So what these nerves do is that they send information to the brain. Now they don't just do that on their own. Chemokines are responsible for activating these signals, and those chemokines are the kinins, especially the bradykinins. Now the bradykinins activate the nerve endings to send information to the brain that something is happening, and that information is interpreted as pain, and that's what brings us to our last sign of inflammation. So this is the activity that happen in inflammation. So a quick recap: there are two phases of inflammation: the vascular phase and the cellular phase. The vascular phase has to do with the blood vessels. The cellular phase has to do with the cells of the innate immune system. All right, so we now have three basic stages: vasodilation, which is brought about by histamine entering into the blood vessel, thereby opening up the blood vessel, sending great amount of blood into the site of infection, and this causes the redness and the heat as a result of increase in temperature. The next thing that happens is that the prostaglandins and the cytokines are act on the blood vessels to retract the cells, and that's what we call vascular permeability. The cells become permeable, all right, allowing for the migration of white blood cells, which are neutrophils and other phagocytic cells, out of the blood vessels into the this portion here, the hypodermis, to fight against this foreign body that enters. All right, and the pain is categorized by the nerve ending sending the signal as a result of the activation by bradykinins to the brain to interpret that particular information as pain. So this is a quick run through of what happens in inflammation.